Okay, this is chapter 17, and in this lecture, I'm going to talk about assignment of contracts, which generally mean both assignment and delegation. So if you see a contract, sometimes they refer to a delegation when they use the word assigning. But I want to talk to you a little bit about the difference. So basically, the assignment and delegations occur after a contract has been made. That's really important to remember. And one of the parties, maybe even both of the parties, the contract, have this third party that they want to transfer rights or duties to. And so assignment and delegation are only possible once the contract has been made. Sometimes the person when they're entering the contract has to do this. And so a transfer of rights under a contract is called an assignment. And an appointment of a third person to perform a duty under a contract is called a delegation. So easy to remember, we assign rights and we delegate duties. So assign rights, delegate duties. Let's talk about creating an assignment. An assignment when we're going to give someone the rights to what are benefits basically of our contract. We can do this in many ways as long as we show that we want to intend to assign to them some our rights. And we don't even need a writing unless the statute of frauds requires it. No consideration is necessary. Basically, I'm just going to assign rights. I don't have to explain why I'm giving you my rights to the benefits of my contracts or anything of that nature. Um, and if it's a gratuitous assignment, it's revocable. So here's the key. I have a right to receive something, maybe it be money or a service. And after the contract is made, I agree to assign that right to you. One thing is, it doesn't need to be in writing. I don't have to have some kind of new contract with consideration. But if I'm just doing that, saying, hey, so and so, part of our contract is paying me 500, I'm going to go ahead and have them pay you the 500. I let the other party know, hey, pay my 500 to you. If it's a gift, up until the moment you receive it, because once you receive a gift, you become the owner, it is actually revocable. Okay. So when we look at assignment of rights, I'm transferring all my rights, title, and interest that I have available to me under my contract. And you basically stand in the shoes as the person who's going to get reap the rewards of that assignment. We have an obligor in an original contract who has to perform. They have a duty to perform to an obligee. That is, maybe they have to pay money. Maybe they have to perform a service. Okay, so let's say you are my obligor and you are going to pay me 500. I'm the obligee because I'm going to paint your house. Okay, what you're going to do is I say, you know what? Why don't you go ahead, please, and pay? I'm the obligee that's receiving the 500. I'm going to assign my $500 to Joe. So I'm now the assigner, and Joe is the assignee. And so I'm transferring my right to receive the money from you, the obligor, to now Joe. And what that means is now you, in this new assignment, you are still obligated for 500, but you're going to pay the assignee Joe. Okay? Assignability of rights will not be effective if, for example, it's contrary to public policy. Just like a contract, if it's contrary to public policy, it's not going to be effective. And what that means is where the assignor normally would have rights to enforce the benefits. If it's contrary to public policy, they will not. Or if there's a non-assignment clause in the first contract, okay? So for example, in the first contract, it says you can't assign these rights to anyone. If I assign my rights to someone and they try to go after the person I was in contract with to get the rights, it's going to be unenforceable because there was a non-assignment clause in our original contract. Or it adversely affects the obligor in a significant way. Because remember now, the obligor has to what? Give the rights over or do the benefits of the contract to another party, right? So let's say I sign a contract to supply all the cement that your company needs, right? And so my benefit of my contract is that I get this exclusive contract, but I'm a small construction business with about $1 million per year in revenue. And so I say, hey, I'm going to let ABC Core have the benefit of having that exclusive contract where you are going to provide them with all the cement they need. Well, the problem is if they have a 10 million per year revenue, it's going to drastically increase any supply requirements, and that's going to be a problem. So just that is one of the ways that assignability cannot be enforced. If it involved a personal relationship or an element of personal skill or character, sometimes that may not be enforceable. And if you're assigning rights, when it comes to an assignee-employer relationship, you don't ordinarily need the consent of the employees. So I want to talk about a case. We have Staples Filer versus Staples Inc. Staples was paying HFP money for a product to produce some supplies. Okay, they have their separate contract. In a completely different contract, HFP owes money to Filer. Okay, so what they say is, hey, why don't I assign you the rights that I have for money that Staples owes me, and instead of Staples paying me my benefits, they pay you. So I'm still obligated to give them what I needed to under the contract, HFP, but now instead of Staples paying HFP, they're going to pay Filer. So basically, before the assignment, the original contract, Staples was the obligor to pay HFP, right, in exchange for the materials and things like that. And the side contract was, hey, HFP owes Filer money, so I'm just going to give you the rights where Staples now will instead pay Filer. Well, the problem was that HFP did not pony up to its side of the contract with what the supplies were, so Staples withheld payment. Well, if you're an assignee of a contract, basically, if you're supposed to receive benefits of a contract, you can enforce that and say, hey, I should be receiving these benefits. So what does Filer do? Filer sues. So if the assignment is good, HFP, this should say Filer can enforce the rights against Staples, okay? Because Filer is the one that's now has the benefit. Filer attempted to enforce the rights, but the problem is herein. The original contract between HFP and Staples said that Staples could assign in whole or part its rights and obligations without HFP's consent, but on the other side, HFP needed the consent of Staples to assign or transfer any of its rights or obligations. And since they didn't have consent of Staples, the contract then, the assignment clause was in the original contract was valid, saying, hey, we have this clause, it's a valid clause, and so you cannot assign because it says you have to get consent of Staples. So, unless the circumstance indicates the contrary, a prohibition of assignment of the contract, though, is going to be construed as barring only the delegation to the assignee of the signer's performance. What that means is, in the case that we just talked about, it said that the prohibition of assignment specifically said you cannot delegate or assign rights or responsibilities. But if it says that you cannot assign any rights to the contract, that's going to be interpreted as only a prohibition of delegation of duties, okay? So you have to remember that delegation of duties has to be specifically stated if you want to prohibit the delegation in a contract by using a assignment clause. So, a contract prohibit assignment of all rights, because remember I said they use assignment as the general term. It applies only to duties. You can, what it says is basically, if it says you cannot assign it any rights or all rights, it's going to say, the court's going to say, well, what they meant is you can't delegate duties. Okay, so let's talk about delegation of duties. What we have is we have an obligor and an obligee again, and what the obligor in the first place, and then later, so the contract is made, someone has to do something in return. So let's say I have to paint your house for $500, right? And so I'm obligor to paint your house for $500. And I decide I'm going to appoint a delegatee to perform that. I'm going to have somebody else paint it, okay? So what does that mean? That means that now me, the obligator who is supposed to paint your house, am a delegatee, meaning I've delegated that to a third party, right? And that third party now, the delegatee, is obligated to paint your house. And when we talk about delegation of duties, the original obligee, who you have to do the work for, is able to enforce the contract still against the original obligor who is supposed to perform, and against the delegatee who now has to perform as well. So you can go back after both of them. A party may perform its duty through a delegatee unless otherwise agreed, or if the party has a substantial interest in having the original promisor perform or control the acts. So what do we mean by this? Okay, you can delegate pretty much any duties, but those that are in the contract prohibited, right? If we have a prohibition in our contract that you can't delegate any duties, or if it's special goods or something special that has to be done, that cannot be delegated, okay? And the key again for delegation is the party delegating the duty is never off the hook until it's done. They still are going to be liable if the delegatee, the person they delegated, does not perform. An assignment of the contract of all my rights under the contract, or an assignment in similar general term, is an assignment of rights, and unless the language indicate it's a delegation of performance of the duties of the assigner, and its acceptance by the assignee constitutes a promise by him to perform the duties, okay? So if we're saying all my rights under the contract, basically they're saying, hey, the performance of the duty is all of them, and so that the delegatee has to perform all of them. And the promise is enforceable by either the assigner or the other party. So if, and what I mean by the delegator, because again, they use assignment a lot, but the party who delegated the duties can enforce the contract if you don't do what you're supposed to. And the original person who is supposed to receive the benefit of those services or goods or whatever was supposed to be done can also sue, right? Here's the kicker. If the delegation, if there is a party that delegates an assignment, so they delegate performance as it creates reasonable grounds for insecurity. Okay, what that means is I automatically, if I delegate any duties, because our contract between each other doesn't say I can't, that automatically is going to create reasonable grounds for insecurity. And what's that mean? Basically means that you can ask for assurances in writing and demand assurance of due performance. And if you don't receive that assurance in a reasonable time, you can suspend what you owe me. So if I say I'm delegating my duties to Joe because our contract didn't say we could, and it's not a special type of contract, let's say it's mowing the lawn, well, you can, that automatically, because I delegated that, you can ask for some kind of assurance that that's going to be done, and you do not have to pay, or you can suspend anything you have been doing for me until you have those assurances. So we have this delegation of duty or assignments of rights. They are not a new contract. It's a separate contract, right? A separate agreement. If we want a separate agreement, we do novation. Novation is when you replace one of the parties in an agreement between two parties. So you have two parties have an agreement, and the two parties plus now this third party agree to come up with a separate contract, and I'm just going to replace the obligation. Now, instead of me doing something, Fred is going to do it. Let's use this as an example. Mary agrees to pay Stephanie to build her fence. Stephanie says, hey, I can't do this. I just don't have the required supplies. And so Mary says, you know what? That's okay. Seth has agreed to pay, Seth has agreed to do it, so I'm going to pay him. And Stephanie and Mary and Seth all agree. So Mary now has found a substitute to which Stephanie agrees. And Seth says, hey, I'll do it. So now in this case, we're not going to have to worry. Stephanie doesn't have to worry about it. She's no longer liable because there is a novation. There's a new contract between Seth and Mary. Okay, quiz questions 1 and 2. So if you want to stop your video and answer these and put your answers in the quiz section. And if you could, make sure you just capitalize the letters and no need for a period. Here is questions 3 through 6. Let's talk about privity. Privity is a relationship between parties of a contract that allows them to sue each other, but it prevents outside third parties from doing so generally. So that means I'm in a contract with you and you're in a contract with me. You can sue me or I can sue you, but generally speaking, nobody else has privity or standing to sue. We have third party beneficiaries, however. So if a business pays for a professional to, let's say, landscape property, and the neighbors are getting a benefit from it, but then they find out that the professional breached its contract. Well, the neighbors are a third-party beneficiary, but they can't go after them for breach of contract, right? And this is called an unintended beneficiary. I'm kind of skipping ahead of myself here. If an incidental unintended beneficiary was the example. But if we have this contract and we intend to make the contract to benefit a third party, that's called an intended beneficiary, and they can have privity. Third party beneficiaries then can have privity. Okay, so the general rule is third parties don't generally have privity to contract, but if it's an intended beneficiary, what does that mean? Well, there's two types. There's a creditor and a donor. But the key is that during the making of the contract, both parties understand that this contract is for the benefit of someone. So if a third party was the intended beneficiary, then they can enforce the contract, and they're subject to the same defenses that could be made against the benefactor. What I talked about when I said, hey, I'm basically an incidental, unintended beneficiary if I'm the neighbor of the place that's getting landscaping, is similar to members of the public being in unintended beneficiaries of contracts made by the government. The government makes contracts all the time that benefit us, but we're called incidental beneficiaries, also called unintended, and that means we can't sue if there's a breach just because we were a beneficiary of it. So incidental beneficiaries are ones that it was not made in the intent with an intent to benefit a beneficiary. And that means you cannot then go and enforce the contract against either party that had the contract together. So the government makes a contract to put in a public park. You can't sue if the government breaches. You can't sue if the people who made the public park breaches. You know why? Because you're just an incidental beneficiary. If the contract was made with intent to benefit the beneficiary, and it was intended to be a gift, it's called a donee beneficiary. And the only person that you could possibly go after is then the promisor, the person who promised you the benefit. And that's going to depend on the circumstances. But in a creditor beneficiary, meaning, hey, we're going to make this contract, and the purpose of me making this contract is because I, let's say, owe you money. So I'm going to make a contract with, instead of paying you money, I am going to do services for Steve. And I'm going to say, Steve, the whole intent of this is so that you can pay for the money that I owe. And both of us know that it's meant to benefit you because I owe you money. You could go after both Steve and I because it's a creditor beneficiary. But when can you do this? When you vest, when your interest vests. So if you're an intended beneficiary, a creditor beneficiary, if you say, yes, I agree to that, we make this promise during the making of the contract. Hey, I can't pay you, but I'm going to do this for Steve so he pays you. And you agree to it, you've become vested. You can now go after both Steve or I if you don't end up getting your money. Or if you brought suit to enforce the promise, or justifiable reliance on that promise. You've relied on that promise. The only time a donee beneficiary, one who's getting it as a gift, can vest is when they have materially changed their position in justifiable reliance on the promise. So here are quiz questions 7 and 8, and following are 9 and 10. This should sum up um, third-party beneficiaries, assignments, and delegations. One thing I'd like you to remember is assignments and delegations are made after a contract has already been made with someone else, and it's just kind of an after, it's a side contract afterwards. A beneficiary contract, third-party beneficiary, is during the making of the contract, there was an intent for the parties, that the parties knew there was an intent for it to benefit